coming into the harbor, I always tell everybody about coming back home. The flags are waving, Statue of Liberty, and going down the gangplank, little white soldiers says, whites to the right, niggers to the left. Coming back home after 9 months in Germany as a POW, fighting for this country.
In a time of extreme military and public segregation, the Tuskegee Airmen fought their way through 2 wars, one on the battlefield and one in their own home, eventually rising above and breaking the barriers that attempted to hold them back from success, leading to some of the first steps towards the desegregation of the military and progress towards equal rights for all ethnicities. Up until 1948, the U.S. military was segregated much like the rest of the public due to the Jim Crow laws of the South and the separate but equal principles after the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case in 1896. Desegregation of the military wasn't written in law until July 26, 1948. However, steps towards this accomplishment started a few years sooner during World War II, beginning with the Tuskegee Airmen. But before they even got the chance to train as airmen, they were already barred from the opportunity. In 1939, Congress passed the Civilian Pilot Training Act as the debate over joining the war grew. This act allowed men to sign up and train to be pilots should the U.S. join the war. However, the law specifically excluded African Americans. When the exclusion was noticed by some of the public and African American community, outraged black newspapers and civil rights movement fighters brought the issue into further public view. This attention gained support from more citizens, white and black alike. Finally, September 16, 1940, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, requiring the U.S. military to enlist African Americans, and President Franklin Roosevelt announced the opportunity publicly in October. With this starting victory, the Tuskegee Airmen slowly began to form with rising African American enlistment. On March 22, 1941, the 99th Pursuit Squadron was officially activated, the first Tuskegee group. Shortly after, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited their current base location. At her request, she was taken on a flight by African American Chief C. Anderson, the Tuskegee Institute's chief instructor pilot. Upon her return to Washington, D.C., she supported and defended their importance and capabilities, further helping the program gain more public support. Although the first cadets began official training in July 1941, the Tuskegee were considered more of an experimental group than a team preparing for action in the war.
The old Tuskegee Airmen, the older guys were 99th Fighter Squadron, and they had been taught how to fly and everything. But they said they were still in the States. They wouldn't ship them overseas. And they said, well, they can't fly, they don't know how to fly, and this and that, and made us look bad.
Despite this view of the group, the Tuskegee Airmen continued to take their training seriously as if they would be joining the war. Throughout their training and preparation, they were moved around a few times, and command was switched from one white officer to the next. But despite this, they kept training. Conditions stayed this way until around December 7, 1941, the day of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. As the U.S. entered World War II, the demand for more pilots suddenly erupted. The Tuskegee Institute trained thousands more cadets as the others in the 99th and new groups improved. Finally, the 99th, now a fighter squadron, was deployed to North Africa in April 1943. They served in the 12th Air Force for some time, but like back home in the U.S., whites and blacks were segregated groups. The Tuskegee Airmen were given second-hand P-40 planes to use on missions while stationed in North Africa. Unfortunately, these planes were much slower and more difficult to maneuver than the enemy's. The 99th Commander, Colonel Benjamin Davis Jr., met before the War Department's Advisory Committee after the men complained. He defended their complaints and the impressive record of the Tuskegee Airmen from their time in North Africa and Sicily. His final request was for them to allow the airmen to continue serving in the war. Just the next day, October 17, 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron was deployed from North Africa to Italy. Here they were more integrated with the white men of the 79th Fighter Group and were often given more missions along with better equipment, including P-51 Mustang planes, whose tails they painted red, shortly after giving them the popular name Red Tails. Just a few months later, in February of 1944, 3 more groups from the Tuskegee Institute whom had completed their training joined the 99th in Italy. They were the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, and combined with the 99th, they became the 332nd Fighter Group. Throughout the rest of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen were deployed on a plethora of missions throughout Italy, building their respect not only among the fighter group they served alongside, but many other squadrons and groups as well. The respect for the group even spread around the world among many of the Allied countries and even amongst some of the Germans.
I'm there trying to get loose, and I hear something. There's a German with a rifle aimed at me, and while I'm getting out, he's looking at me, and I can tell his eyes are bugged because he's looking at me and my color of my skin, and he saw the little gold bar, and he saluted me.
They flew their last mission on April 26, 1945, just 2 weeks before the German surrender. In total, the Tuskegee Airmen flew over 15,000 attack missions, along with 36 German planes damaged in flight and 237 on ground, destroyed 1,000 rail cars and transports and a German destroyer. 66 Tuskegee Airmen lost their lives over the course of the war, and 32 became POWs but were later returned home. The Tuskegee Airmen are famous for having a perfect record of never losing a bomber on mission, but contrary to this popular belief, the Tuskegee Airmen did lose approximately 25 bombers during escorts. However, this is still an impressive record compared to the average loss of 46 among other fighter groups. From the creation of the Tuskegee Institute to the end of the war, about 1,000 pilots and over 14,000 people were trained through the Tuskegee Institute for various positions, including technical preparation and bomber squadrons. The war in Europe was won, and the Tuskegee Airmen had helped make it possible. Unfortunately, this was the only battle they won until years later. When they returned to the U.S., they were thrown right back into the horrendous mess of segregation. Some of them even feared the threat of the Jim Crow laws as well as lynching. One of the restationed groups of the Tuskegee Airmen, the 477th Medium Bombardment Group, was moved to Freeman Field in Indiana. Immediately, the commanding officer, Colonel Robert Selway, segregated the groups on base, including restricting their access to the officers' clubs. In peaceful protest, the airmen entered the club anyway, and 61 were arrested. When asked to sign a document agreeing to the segregation on base, over 100 of the Tuskegee Airmen refused, and, as disobeying orders during wartime was punishable by death, risked their lives doing so, and some even continued the peaceful protests. Despite this mistreatment upon their return, many of the Tuskegee Airmen continued to serve in the military for years after the war. In the end, their perseverance and effort helped lead to one of the first accounts of desegregation in the military. In 1948, President Harry Truman issued the Executive Order 9981, officially and lawfully desegregating the military. This was just one step of many leading to the later civil rights movement for rights in every place for African Americans. Over the years, many of the men continued their military careers. Benjamin Davis Jr. became the first black general in the U.S. Air Force. George Roberts was the first black commander of an integrated Air Force unit and later retired as a colonel. Daniel James Jr. became the first black four-star general in 1975. These men and many others all continued to serve and break the barriers that held them back their whole lives. In 2007, over 300 of the original Tuskegee Airmen were present to receive the Congressional Gold Medal from President George Bush. During the ceremony, he saluted the men, saying that it was to help atone for all the unreturned salutes and unforgivable indignities. The Tuskegee Airmen broke through the barriers of segregation and, though it took years after their service for this recognition, they succeeded. As Colonel Elmer Jones, one of the original Tuskegee Airmen, put it, "It's never too late for your country to say that you've done a great job for us."